How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you. Today, I'm joined by a nationally competitive powerlifter and a human performance scientist. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Dr. Megan Bryanton-Jones. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
No worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. How are you? What's been happening in your world?
Things have been a little bit of back and forth. I wasn't the new is I wasn't actually planning on teaching this semester, so I teach casually for a local university, and I wasn't planning on it, so I could really dive into more of my business, Kinetic Advantage Consulting. And then they contacted me on Thursday and was like, "We need someone. Our other person bailed. Can you teach?" So.
Oh.
So that kind of curveball, it's kind of pushed back things on what I was planning on releasing, combined with other family stuff. So this week is like my fresh start. So this is going to be a good kind of getting the wheels turning again and inspiring me for more of my content as well. So I appreciate being here.
Oh, good. And what is it? Is it full-time teaching or is it just part-time teaching? How is that going to be going?
Yeah, it's just kind of part-time. So whenever you're asked to like kind of teach a course or you just teach the classes. And that's really what the obligation is. It's nice because it gives me a little bit of flexibility with my business and, family, starting a family. So that is kind of the optimal situation right now, that I have a lot of flexibility, but I still get to teach. I still get to work with athletes. I still get to work with coaches. I still get to do a little bit of research of my own, whether it's, at a university or kind of more privately. So doing a bunch of everything, hustling, because I'm inspired by everything.
Plenty of stuff to keep you busy then. And how has everything been going? Sort of, are things kind of relatively back to normal in terms of people getting back into their gyms and being able to have a little bit more access to stuff? Because I know, there's been gym closures, things opening back up, whereas everything seems to be relatively getting back to normal, if you like.
And like in Canada here, it really depends on what province you live in. With me being online, it wasn't so bad because I have clients from, all over the world, going from complete opposite, like Australia and over in Europe and everything like that. So I was concerned when like COVID first started, because I'm like, oh, my clients aren't going to be able to train. How can I help them? So I did like a little bit of a pivot to more online education. I started releasing some online courses, teaching the biomechanics of powerlifting and more like consulting with coaching groups and doing office hours and stuff like that. But I got really lucky that I have like the most amazing clients who are so dedicated that they just went and bought their own gym equipment and they just kept training. So like I would say 90% of my clients kept training as normal. Like some of them had like squat rocks built out of wood. They're those dedicated clients, and I appreciate them so much, and they're amazing. Yeah. But yeah, it actually was, it opened up, it encouraged me to open up a different type of avenues to, providing my services and realizing, okay, like these are my other capabilities that I need to be also expanding on and letting people know and focusing on.
Was that only highlighted sort of throughout COVID, or had that been something that you'd been thinking about for a while? Because I know from my point of view, especially with the gyms being closed, like over in the UK, we were locked down it felt like forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then it also, rather than going from session into session or call into call, there was a little bit more time to develop some systems that, at some point the gym's going to reopen, to develop systems that was only going to add more value to clients and give them a better service. So was that something that you'd already been thinking about, or did COVID sort of push you in that direction?
Yeah, it's been something that I wanted to do. And I'm a very I don't like to pre-plan when I'm going to do kind of like a new project, or like I have the idea. And then when it kind of naturally is, the right time, like for me releasing, like I really want to do a book about video analysis. But it didn't, I've had that project on my, on the back burner for a couple of years, but it's like, I need the following. And so I needed to build my social media. I needed to build my presence up. In terms of having some free time, I was a sole proprietor business owner with a now 2-year-old. Back during COVID, she wasn't even a year old. So I had uh, no childcare. I had a crazy toddler or infant, and my husband's working full time. I'm working from home, teaching from home, trying to schedule nap time. So it wasn't that I had more time, because even with my teaching, we pivoted to online, like synchronous or asynchronous instruction. So no, my time didn't open up. I ended up actually being more busy because I couldn't have childcare. And yeah, so there was a lot of lack of sleep, but I really think it was worth it. It was more that like COVID kind of inspired me to like, lit the fire under my ass to do more things as like kind of a preventative measure, which I think a lot of business owners and trainers, they did that.
Yeah, definitely. You said it there, sort of, to pivot and change, because I think it was one of those things that no one had ever really experienced before. Which, and it might not, hopefully, touch wood, some things like that don't happen again. But it was something different that everyone had to deal with. So obviously, gave a little bit of an introduction, but anyone listening who might not know your background, follow you on social media. Just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself?
Yeah, I'll tell you my story. So the whole reason I went to grad school and started my master's, well, like one, I'm not a very big 9 to 5 job person, and that's why I do multiple things so I can just kind of juggle it around. Um, I was competing in powerlifting when I was doing my undergrad. I was like, I'm going to be a vet. No, I'm going to be a forensic anthropologist. Like so many things that, you think you can chat, like conquer the world when you're in undergrad. But then I got into powerlifting, and it was this sport that I know everyone listening really identifies, that it becomes a culture and it becomes kind of like a part of your identity. It is an amazing sport. Like I was always athletic, competitive in soccer and everything growing up. And I kind of like, I'm like, why couldn't I put this much effort into like training for a sport like soccer, where I could have got like scholarships or something? But I was like, no, when I got like to a certain level and my capabilities peaked, I just stopped trying. I was like, why couldn't I have this with like what I do with powerlifting? Like I literally, like as a sport, is just training. And it was really just because of the sport and the people that I met. It had nothing to do about like, you know, the time commitment or whatever it was, or the pains and aches you put on your body, but it's just the sport itself. And the sport is what brought me into wanting to go to grad school. And basically I say like I researched the squat and specialized in the squat because I sucked at squatting. It was like my kryptonite. And if I was going to bomb in a competition, it was in squats. And that was back in my day when it was all equip lifting. There was no classics. So if you wanted to be competitive, especially internationally, you had to lift equip. So little me, 52 kilo lifter, lifting with these big boys and squatting in my equipped gear, probably my second competition. So it was like competing or lifting for like 2 months, and got into equipped lifting. And that brought me into, injuring myself because I was training like the big guys. And that sucking at squatting and the back injury that I went through, it really inspired my research for my master's. And we looked at how muscles contribute with respect to barbell load and squat depth, and was developing some novel techniques for that. So that's really what kind of put me on the map. From there, I took what I learned about how the muscles are contributing, and I applied it to more movement strategy. I wanted to know, not just athletes. If we really want to understand human movement, we got to look at all the possible situations. So I really looked at geriatrics, young adults, stroke. I've looked at Parkinson's. And so it's like you're looking at all the possible, states of the human body and what do they do. And that really opened my eyes to all the possible influences of why we move the way we do, whether it's strength, neurodegenerative decline, balance, even some psychological, like, self-efficacy and, confidence and fear and stuff like that, and how it really influences our strategy and how we move. When it came to older adults, it really provided a lot of insight looking at the sit to stand about how strength really influences the strategy. And like, it's a very similar movement to the squat. In Canada, if you want to be, successful as an academic, you have to go clinical. They don't like to fund sports. So that was kind of part of it, but it was always in the back of my mind. It's like, this is going to help me better squatter and all those things. So it kind of led me down that rabbit hole of really understanding compensation strategies. And when one muscle, doesn't have enough gas in the tank, looking at fatigue, when one muscle is relatively weak, you're like, what happens? And there was this big kind of, sign and light bulb that the relative strength between your joints, between your muscle groups across the joints, like your knee extensors, your hip extensors, your calves, your back extensors, it really influences movement strategy very strongly. And this really resonated with me because you think about powerlifting, it's the most unique sport. People think it's so basic because you're just training to compete your training, but there's really no other sports like it because you're chronically, doing the exact same lift. You're chronically lifting heavier loads. It's not, you're not always maxing out, but the sport requires you to really push the limits. And with compensation, and I used to be like the technique Nazi for myself, like, oh my God, I leaned forward. Oh my God, my knee. And I was so hard on myself. And then understanding them in my research, it kind of like opened up, realizing that, okay, we move the way we do because of what our body's trying to do to achieve the goal of the task. And it kind of like turned the light on, what form breakdown is and what, why our technique changes. And it turned into something that, you don't think of it as so negative. Think of it as like a possible opportunity for, growth, because you can identify, shifting a loading demands. If one muscle can't do its job, it's going to transfer it. And if those kinetics of forces in the muscles change, then our kinematics, which is the geometry of our movement, which is what we observe, the movement, we leaning forward or we're more upright, that is kinematics, that is biomechanical analysis. And so if our kinetics influence our kinematics, then we can use our movement strategy and the changes of it to know how muscles are contributing. And if one can't contribute very well for whatever reason it is, then our technique's going to break down. So instead of thinking of it as like, oh, you suck at powerlifting because you lean forward or you do this or you fail in this position, think of it, I think of it as like an opportunity to take your performance actually to a whole nother level, because what muscle needs to be targeted or what aspect that's holding you back or causing the plateauing needs to be targeted. And that's essentially kinetic advantage consulting in itself, because I was always kind of doing it. And then I reached out to a friend. I was like, do you think people would be interested in this? He's like, yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it was a lot of time of just getting my name out there, sitting on powerlifting platforms with my camera and offering technique assessments. And those assessments are really what kind of proved what I knew to people, as well as like the content creation on my social media. So once I was able to actually prove my name, and that's where the rest kind of took off from there. But it was enough for me to be able to leave academia. I love research and I love teaching. But when it comes to getting a job in Canada, there are none. And I say, like, I'm the epitome of like a millennial, that there were no jobs. So I made one for myself. But I didn't want to be stuck making minimum wage with a ton of student loan debt, living in a city by myself. And I wanted to start a family with my husband, who was 3 hours away from me. And I was traveling. Like, I started the business just to have gas money to be able to see him. And yeah, it was enough that I was like, okay, this is actually so fulfilling. And that's where I went full steam into it. But I I still also like to keep my foot in the door with the university. So I did go to school for 12 years to become a university professor. And then, so there's that back at me being like, maybe you should just not like close that door entirely. But like each year that I keep going and Casey keeps growing, and there's so many collaborations and projects we just want to do with these other groups, and like the long-term growth that I see, whether I'm, doing what I'm doing now, or, developing more like online technique assessment tools or something like that. It's really exciting, and it's actually more exciting than sitting in a lab doing research. So I appreciate everyone who cares what I have to say.
I think from that, you put it across that you enjoy what you do, and that's why I always like to ask people's background and why they got involved in what they do, because alongside things sometimes it can swap and change. And when you mentioned there about your injury, that sign of inspired you to go down a certain route. I know for me, I had visions of starting off originally playing rugby, thinking I'll be a strength and conditioning coach. I'll work with rugby teams and get all the stash and go to World Cups. Whereas actually, from actually going into leaving university, going into the real world, working a little bit more, I couldn't dedicate as much time to rugby as much. Experienced a little bit of working in strength and conditioning, and realized that actually, coaching people to get stronger in the gym, I can still use all that biomechanics. I can still use all that academic information, still do something you enjoy. And as well, I think with the research and the academic side of things, I think sometimes it's good to have that balance a little bit. Still, that in the I don't know whether in the trenches is the right phrase, but that real world training, but then also having that academic side. Just a couple of things from what you've mentioned there. Obviously, with the knowledge that you've got of biomechanics, but then also from your sort of own injury, from the assessments and consultations that you've done and the athletes that you work with, do you think that was a nice balance? And how did that kind of impact how you were able to speak to the athletes and put your point across to show them that actually I understand where you're coming from, maybe try this to improve your performance, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And like I say, none of this was planned. Like it all was just kind of like a happy coincidence that it worked out this like it did. And that's more like my husband, like he doesn't has never competed in powerlifting. So he didn't really understand like the reach of the sport. And so it was kind of, he's like, really think you can build a business model on one sport? Like, don't you think you should be going all areas? It's like, well, specializing small, and then you grow. It's like Amazon, they specialize small, and now look at them. So now he's like, oh my goodness. He's just kind of like being like, okay, like it's not that I know what I'm doing. It's that I'm riding the wave of like, and I say to follow your passions, but like your passions have to make money and pay your bills and support your family. But I've been very fortunate that all of my passions so far have kind of like come together very nicely. And that's why I mean like happy coincidence. I was like, maybe I secretly know what I'm doing. And I just, have still the imposter syndrome and don't give myself enough credit. But I do. And like I said, I thought I was going to be all academia. And I really thought that it was going to be the opposite, that my strength training background and my kind of real world application was going to really complement me as a researcher and as an academic. Like during my master's, my mentor, my master supervisor, Dr. Lauren Chu, like he, instead of having like RA hours in the lab, we're getting paid by the university to be a research assistant. He had me in the gym training people. He's like, I don't care about how much, books you read or how much data you analyze. If you don't understand what that data is actually telling you, then it's useless. And, whether, others will agree or disagree, what makes you good at understanding human movement in research was watching people. And so it was literally just watching athletes do movements. He hated that I was a powerlifter and wanted me to do Olympic weightlifting. But it just kind of like put a certain mentality in my head that, I'm a very applied person. Theoretical math and stuff like that. Like, yeah, I can do it and I can explain it, but it's not fun. What's fun to me is taking the data and then being like, okay, let's apply it to a training program. Let's apply it to this athlete. And then unfortunately, because I wanted to really understand human movement as everything, and I think like to a university that you're like spreading yourself, you're being like mediocre at everything rather than specializing in one thing. And no one wanted an applied biomechanist. So they wanted more of like engineering biomechanists that, could write coding and script for their MATLAB, for their research studies, and stuff like that. And that wasn't me. I want to apply biomechanics. I want to apply it to real life. I am that person where like I'm visualizing stuff in thought bubbles in my head. So if I'm like looking around as I'm talking to you, that's what I'm doing. I'm visualizing and I'm applying it to real life. And that's just how I learn things and, interpret things. And that's really what benefits I find like kinesiology students and like strength coaches and lifters, because if they cannot, like you could say like, oh yeah, you need to produce more force, or I don't, just like being very general. It's like, well, what does that actually mean in the real life situation? Or you need to make sure that your shins are like this to, increase or optimize your leg drive. It's like, well, why? It's because, okay, we want to exert effort in the intended direction. We don't want to waste energy. And so that made me, I realized, really good at kind of translating the science to, the people actually need to use the science. And so that, it just kept kind of shifting this way of like, no, we need someone that has MATLAB coding experience. No, we want an engineer. No. And then it was just kind of like, okay, I'm shifting more and more towards working more applied with more athletes. And then it was just to the point where I was like, I really love doing this. It'd be amazing to, have tenure at a university and basically do whatever you want, never get fired, and have such good job security versus, hustling for clients every month. But it's way more fulfilling and happier. So I keep kind of following the, I say it's like I follow the reward, like what's more rewarding. I'm following it. And I've been very fortunate that, people, my clients and everyone, my followers are so amazing that have they've been the ones kind of encourage me more than anything.
Oh, cool. Just one thing, just before as you were talking there, we've mentioned a lot about, human movement and how we can, impact performance. For the gym that I work out, every member who comes in, they actually get a movement assessment. So we have an idea about how they move when they come into the gym. We know what movements they're good at, not very good at, and what we need to work on. And we started out with the FMS movement assessment. We've since, altered and changed that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And one of the best tips that I got given was watch people move, and you start seeing, especially for general population, you start seeing similar things and picking up a little bit more, how people are walking, how people are doing a lunge. What are kind of your thoughts on the movement assessments and what, I know we mentioned about tangents at the start, but it's just coming to my head. What are your thoughts on the FMS as a movement assessment, and what movement assessments, if any, if you've got, or do you have a battery of tests that you've built up over time and know when to choose them and when to use them? Or is there, a certain exercise that certain assessment that you use, most of the time?
So when it comes to like general population in the gym and training, like functional movement screens, all those things, they're really good at understanding like the client's limitations and like what they can and can't do. Right. For me, with the lifters that I work with, they're not usually like never squatted before beginners. It just doesn't work, because I would have to be in the gym with them and help them and cue them. That's what, all the amazing coaches out there that, that is what they're really good at. For me, what I do is kind of like taking a step further in that the lifter knows, they can get depth or like they know they can do the movement. adequately, like maybe not 100% proficiently, and that's, okay, that's completely fine. It's more so than taking it in terms of, explaining why this happens, and, you know, what you should be focusing on in terms of your programming now. So, um, with that, the assessment process that I use, and it's not like a one assessment fits all. It's not, and I'm really trying to kind of like put it on like a checklist or a flow chart, and that's really what I've been working on. But like, of course, my brain's like, okay, what about this? This could, the flow chart is like, instead of being very streamlined, it just keeps going like this. I'm like, okay, how can I make this a lot more user friendly? So I've been collecting data for that to kind of confirm things. But um, my assessment process, it started by, again, just kind of watching and tracking and using a video analysis software. I use Dartfish, just being like, okay, if I track this, what does it tell me? And the big thing that when it comes to powerlifting, it's that discerning between like what you think you should, look like, or how you think you should squat. Is it actually beneficial? Can you actually maintain it as barbell load increases? So with my research and understanding how the different muscles contribute during various parts of lift, how this changes as load increases, I took that research and I use it for the interpretation of the lifts. So first, it's by identifying, and like my assessments, what I do is I first explain kind of like the basic muscle contributions, because there's no point in just being like, okay, no, this is weak, do this, because they're kind of like, well, there's no kind of faith and commitment to it. That doesn't benefit me in the long run, because I need testimonials and I need referrals. So what it is so if we know, for example, in the squat, and I'm always going to use example of squat because one, like it's my background, what I'm known for, but two, that's usually what people are contacting me about in terms of like their struggles the most. Squat is that one. And it's crazy because the squat is the most basic human movement, right? Like we've been needing to do it for, I don't know, millennia. I don't know, like however long, that's too long, however long the human species has been evolved. And we've kind of just butchered it as we've, advanced as entities. So with the research, combining it with that, it's being like, if I know that in this position, in the deeper positions of the squat, in terms of the external loading demands, gravity wanting to pull the barbell down, you have to get deeper. You need to be able to, push your knees forward more. And you need to, you could look like you're going deeper by just leaning forward more and doing good morning. But we know that from the research that the relative muscle contributions, so how hard or relative muscular efforts of the knee extensors, the quads, and how hard they work, they really spike up in the deeper positions. So that was kind of that, light bulb being like, it's really the make it or break it muscle group in deep squatting. And again, powerlifting, you need to be able to go parallel. If you can't succeed in the sport. So that is one thing that's super important for understanding, why lifters can't get depth, or why they fail in the hole, or why their form really breaks down immediately out of the hole. So by explaining, how the muscles contribute in the various parts of the lift, we can identify, sticking points, or like why things slow down, or why lifts fail there, or why the compensation happens. And the compensation is the form breakdown. So if I'm saying that the knee extensors are the make it or break it muscle group in the deeper positions, and they can't do their job, either you're going to fail, or you're going to try and transfer loading from the knee to another muscle at the knee, which is difficult because it's just the quads. Or you can try and transfer it to another joint. So, the calves, well, the calves aren't very powerful. Oh, what's powerful? The big hips in the back, right? So with that and understanding transferring a loading, it was actually geriatric research and looking at, they did some like simulation optimization models being like, hey, if we minimize knee extensor contribution, what happens to this kind of virtual avatar? What happens? And so it was like, okay, the hips are more posterior behind kind of like the center of mass. They're leaned forward more, the shins more vertical. And that makes sense. The more forward the knees are, the harder the quads have to work because of that kind of demands of gravity, the gravitational torques you put on them. So it's like, okay, I need to develop something that, really indicates, and I can actually track that and measure that. So that is what my assessment process was. It was completely novel. And then it was taking that and applying it to the bench and the deadlift, and the energetics and mechanics of those lifts as well. So I developed the assessment process myself, based on all my research and all the research studies that I pulled from, and all the new stuff. Like, I'm continuously trying to evolve it. There's some lifters where like they don't benefit from looking at this, so we're going to look at this instead. So I will modify it, and we'll look at more bar speeds. um, the more, like, I have clients that have been with me for like 2 to 3 years, and there's no point in just always tracking the same thing. So, okay, if it looks the same, but what about when we look at the speed? Like, does the speed slow down in certain parts of the lift? Okay, again, I know that this muscle is kind of that make it or break it muscle group in that part of the lift where the speed is decreased. Why? Right? They weren't able to maintain their force output. So there's different things that I do. There's really no set standard, but for the first kind of assessment, it's like the big one where, okay, we're going to identify your weakest link, and we're going to identify your strength. In competition, you want to play to your strengths. I have clients that like get so frustrated when their form breaks down in competition. I'm like, that's good, right? We got something to work with. Don't get frustrated that, you lean forward more or things were slower. It's just your body trying to do what it needs to do to lift the most out of way possible. If you got weak quads and you're so concerned about staying upright and push, having your knees forward, like you have to push your knees forward to be more upright, but they're not strong enough to do it, like, you're not going to lift as much weight. So what do you care about more, being successful as a powerlifter or achieving kind of like a standard, right? As long as it's with, reason that, they're not going to hurt themselves with it. And, um, and I'm trying to kind of promote that, stop the technique shaming. It's your body, if the sport of powerlifting is moving the most amount of weight possible, then let your body do it. Right. And then use information from what happens as barbell load increases, right? If one muscle group's working a lot harder and it can't do its job, why would the central nervous system want to like injure it and like max it out, right? It's really damaging to a muscle to make it max out when it's like, okay, I could actually get this muscle to help out, right? And we change the kinetics, the forces, our kinematics, our technique is going to move to transfer that loading. And so that's what kind of the whole thing is about, right? Like it's taking into account the mechanics of our body positioning, but also realizing that the brain has a big role, right? We can't just interpret the body as like this rigid linked system of objects. There's the brain's like, I don't want to damage a muscle. Like, it's getting sensory feedback. It's monitoring what's going on at the sole of your foot. Like, am I leaning forward, or is my weight on my heels? Well, that's a lot more posturally challenging, and I might fall over. So I'm going to use a different type of movement strategy. And so understanding as well that, okay, in this situation, their technique does this. In this situation, their technique does this. But why? It's like, okay, maybe it is the brain trying to be like, okay, I need to do things that I'm going to prioritize this, or I'm going to prioritize this. Powerlifters, again, they need to prioritize force output, not falling over, right? Because if you're going to fall over, what happens? You like get rigid, right? And so that's wasting energy, because you're doing a lot of like extra muscle contraction, a lot of co-contraction, and it's not efficient. So those are the kind of next aspects that I'll take into account after the like kind of the initial assessment of, what's the weakest link. Okay, is it because this muscle just needs to be strengthened, and we're going to do some, accessory exercises purposely to target it and bring up it? Or is it maybe kind of more of like a central nervous system type, motor control issue that we need to address in a certain way? So my brain's always going in a million directions during them, but it's just kind of figuring out this kind of long-term goal plan for the client. And then sometimes they say, okay, let's keep doing this monthly. And then we monitor, and based on what I see, I will, choose the assessment process to best demonstrate what I see to them.
Yeah.
So That's where I always encourage to, watch, don't just understand mechanics, watch people, watch like tens of hundreds of hours of watching is what's going to make you a good movement assessment specialist.
Yeah, there was quite a couple of things that kind of and it was interesting that you said about trying to have your assessment in terms of a flow chart, whereas actually it started getting broader and broader. And as much as with the coaches that I work with, we have a coaches meeting every week. We had a similar thing, and as well with the general population, but also in terms of the strength athletes that I work with as well. It ends up looking at different things in different circumstances, and also what you mentioned there about on competition day, technique isn't going to be perfect, and this might be another rabbit hole and tangent that we might go down, where everyone's chasing this perfect technique, this the perfect squat, the perfect deadlift, whereas actually in competition you're going maximal, and sometimes you're going above maximal because adrenaline and competition, whereas exactly like what you said, okay, if the technique wasn't there, it's our body highlighting areas that we can then work on during training. It's going to be very different what's going to be highlighted in training compared to being competition, but those are the things that you're going to work on, as well as, because obviously the in-depth assessment and tracking of data that you use with athletes that you work with, in terms of the level of the athletes that you work with. Does it change in terms of the feedback and what you're going to let them know compared to an international level athlete to maybe somebody who has just broken into competing at a national level? Does that vary, or does your feedback, is it pretty consistent across the board with the athletes that you work with?
Each assessment kind of has like the same type of underlying kind of foundation of this is why you move the way you do, right? And that's really the maybe you're doing this, and maybe we're going to say, okay, focus on keeping the weight in the middle of your foot, like don't shift it towards your heels, or don't do that. So that could be part of it. Then it could also be, that this muscle is relatively weaker and we need to address programming. When it comes to a lot of the clients that have been reaching out to me more often lately, it's been about injury. And like, I'm not a physio, I'm not a clinician. I'm not that kind of doctor. It is, I don't treat injury. And that's why when people, if they want me to help them treat injury, it's no, I don't do that. You go to a clinician, because that's what they are the experts in. What I then would do is I help identify the mechanism of the injury we use the training videos. So whether it's like a newbie lifter, an experienced lifter, it really depends on what kind of goal they want to achieve with the assessment. If it's a new lifter that just want to understand things and understand kind of like the body and how they're moving, or they'll be like, should I be lifting this way or this way? It's like, well, it's not the technique or that you're choosing that's really holding you back. It's kind of like, being so fixated on the technique that you're choosing that's holding you back. And you think you should look this way, but your body wants to look this way. So it's like, okay, if you want to look this way, then you need to do a lot of this kind of training or practice to achieve that. Or then you can adopt kind of like your technique to accommodate your strengths and take advantage of your strengths. So I don't like to tell people like, you should lift in the heels or shoes or flats or belt or high bar or low bar. It's kind of explaining that like, if you want it to be this way, this is what you have to do. If you want to just like, play to your current strengths, then do it this way. And explaining their weakness, not even just being like, this muscle is relatively weaker. This is why your form breaks down. This is what you're going to do in training. It's also explaining that like being efficient with programming, like depends also on, what stage they're at. Are they competitive and what level they're at? So with new lifters, it's just kind of like building that base foundation. You don't really need to, focus too much on, peaking programming or anything like that. It's just kind of like getting them proficient and ensuring their long-term progress as an athlete. So, they don't hurt themselves. And a great example is, again, I go back to like knee extensors, but it could be like your hip extensors are relatively weaker. But just most people identify with like the good morning type squat strategy or even knee valgus, that if your competition lifts and you're lifting heavy, you know, to a certain, percent 1 RM, you will be doing some sort of transferring of loading. If you're really light, you can achieve whatever the hell technique you want, because your muscles, you don't have to really tax any of the muscles. But if you want to lift heavy, if a muscle can't do the job and be in this, have the limb segment in a certain position, then it's just not going to happen. Your form's going to change. So that means, redistributing loading demands to the stronger muscles, and that's what your brain likes to do. So if you're always taking advantage of your relatively stronger muscles in training, then you're really training them a lot more than your weaker ones. You're always trying to transfer loading away from the weaker ones. And so what can happen in lifters that have a really large disparity between strengths between joints, whether it's their knee is weaker, knees are weaker, knee extensors are weaker, hip extensors are weaker, back, or whatever it is, if they don't choose the accessory lifts properly, then they end up reinforcing their strengths and neglecting their weaknesses. And they'll get to the point where their technique issues get worse and worse and worse, and like get larger and larger. Like, say, if they can't get depth, it's just, it gets worse and worse and worse over time, to the point where they, are doing, their technique is just gone in the opposite spectrum, like of, they want to be this, and then, there's the heavy training, they can't achieve it, they don't address the weaknesses, and then it gets worse and worse and worse over time. And that's usually when injury mechanism comes in. If the knees are weak, then usually there's a lot more leaning forward and a lot more loading chronically on the back. And I say, like, in competition, yeah, you can collapse forward. And sometimes there are freak times where you get a bad spot. This is my experience. And you herniate a disc in your back because of how the spotter grabs you. There are those instances, and I don't want to get people's head because of that. But usually, like, it's safe to lean forward, provided that you're not excessively rounding, and it's more that you're chronically doing something. And that's what I mean by, like, the leaning forward is getting worse and worse over time, because you're just neglecting that weakness and reinforcing the strength. Your body wants to use what's stronger. It wants to base its strategy on how hard the muscles are working. If these muscles have a lot more gas in the tank, it wants to use it, and it's going to, use it more chronically. They're going to get stronger. Oh, it gets stronger, I want to use it even more. So it's like this rabbit hole. And you get to the point where, like, you need to achieve a minimum joint torque to lift a certain barbell. So that's where they will kind of hit this wall, and the plateauing will happen over the long term. So that's kind of like, I try to really emphasize that to newer lifters. Yeah. Being like, and then not to shame, like, make them, new lifters are more deterred by people shaming them and telling them what they should and shouldn't be doing. So it's just kind of being like, you got this. And like giving them the confidence in that, like, don't, people are biased and they're going to have their opinions. So that's kind of the approach that I take with the newer lifters. And then it kind of shifts to, okay, the more advanced lifters, they got to this point where they want to keep progressing. Like, newbie gains are quick, but when you get to a certain level, it's a lot more of a, struggle to get to the next step. So then it's just looking at, maybe they did plateau and they got to that point where, that weakness was neglected over time. Really top advanced lifters, they are actually fairly balanced between their muscle contributions, but they do experience a little bit of a form change. But because there doesn't need to be a lot of transferring of loading, they can actually regulate their technique a lot more. And so that's where I think new lifters are like, well, so-and-so's form didn't break down at, IPF Worlds, who won gold. So that's what I want to do, or that's what I need to be able to achieve. It's nothing to do about maintaining your form. It's about making sure that the muscles are able to do their jobs for that, to look that way. And like some of the world champs that I've worked in and chatted with, it's like, they still get shamed for their technique. But those guys have learned that they can kind of, put it to the side and, put their earmuffs on to be like, you know what, this allows me to be freaking strong. Like, how are you the one to say like, I shouldn't be squatting high bar, I shouldn't be flaring my elbows? And like, yes, I'm talking about Bryce Lewis, I'm talking about Jen Thompson, like the top of the top, and they still get like comments. It's like, that's because it might be different than what the, old school mentality of what, the ghosts of equipped lifting past is kind of what I say, that, the stuff that we were told to do in equipped lifting and still being perpetuated in unequipped to classic. It's like these top lifters have just learned how to play to their strengths in their given technique. And you can see like Jen Thompson with bench, like she does a lot of tricep work. And that's because it makes sense because she's got really strong chest for pecs for a female. Like not a lot of females are able to achieve her elbow position and her bar path efficiency, but her accessory lifts are a lot of triceps. So then, other lifters are watching her and like, they don't understand that. And why that works for her. And then they'll do a lot of triceps. But what if that's a new lifter who's got super weak pecs and then they just keep reinforcing their triceps more and more over time? And they're like, why doesn't that work for me? Or like it stalls. So, and that's really, kind of like another going back to the newbie lifters, you need to be understanding, what you need to work on to ensure long-term progress and not preventing injury from going down rabbit holes of reinforcing the wrong things. And then that is what will get them to the level of the top athletes.
Yeah, I think you said it there. That's why they're at that level. You can, like Jen Thompson, the amount of world titles that you've got in terms of technique, you might be like, oh well, she's not doing this or not doing that, but her record speaks. Oh
yeah, it blows my mind. Like, how could you tell her not to bench that way, or that she shouldn't be, or that's bad for your shoulders? It's like she's been benching for a really long time. And I think the only bad injury she had was her hip, like her pelvis broke or something. Yeah. So it's like, oh, it blows my mind how, and that's what I mean, like the trying to change the perspective of technique and not being so critical and taking kind of like a positive light on it and just stop the shaming so that a new lifter can post their videos without people kind of hounding them. Like, you should be doing this and this. Like, yeah, if they ask for help and ask for perspectives, give it. Even in those, like, I don't even like to do it because I don't want them to feel like, I don't know, negatively or that I'm judging in any way. I'm more so just to focus. If I make any type of comment on someone's lifting video, it's like, oh, wow, like that's some strong quads, or that's, oh, wow, you're really strong. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's kind of amping them up and, building them up more than anything. And that is what powerlifting needs to do, among other sports. And when you actually do look at other sports, like you're looking at, I don't know, track and field, for example, Usain Bolt, like he actually runs like differently than what they think optimal is. And so his unique kind of characteristics of his sprint and his stride, that's actually ended up advancing like sports science in track and field in itself. And it's not that everyone's trying to run like him, but it's understanding that because of his unique characteristics, like his tendon lengths or whatever it is, that type of kind of, outlier characteristics of his running is what allowed him to be that top lifter. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, because as soon as you said about technique, I did actually think about that. I can't remember if I watched something or I read something, but they compared Usain Bolt to, I can't think it was an American guy. Can't think of his name. It'll come back to me later on. I'll just shout this name out and I'll be like, oh, that's what it was.
Yeah, I know. I know who you mean. I'm like picturing his face.
Yeah, it was really sort of textbook technique. But then you've got Usain Bolt, who world record. Are you going to really say, I think we need to work on this? And that's kind of, because one thing that, I always like to touch on, and I've spoken about this with, other people involved in powerlifting, I think has powerlifting has grown as a sport, and a lot more people are getting involved in it, and the world stage is getting bigger and bolder. I think how powerlifters are training, looking at technique, analyzing it, is getting a lot more professional. I think it's professional in all but name, in terms of how much time is dedicated to it. Mm-hmm. Do you think, like what you mentioned there about the old school mentality of, no, this is how we should be squatting, benching, and deadlifting? Do you think that's where potentially new people coming into the sport is kind of thinking about this textbook technique, rather than thinking, you touched on it there, what's going to actually make me as an individual the strongest lifter that I can be to keep progressing?
Yeah. That's why I say like the equipped lifting's past. And I was an equipped lifter. So like I've been there, and I was like I said, I was this little 52 kilo junior lifter, and I got these like world renowned big heavyweight guys, giving me, tips and tricks, but, some things worked really well. Other things just didn't, for me. And like, I still have clients that, are equipped lifters, and it's a completely different sport. Like, you're trying to maximize what you get out of, your suit and everything like that. And that's what you're trying to peak. And kind of going back to, when it comes to like more advanced lifters, we will focus on, in kind of like your whole training, like base cycle or building cycle, it's like, or blocks, it's like you want to bring up the weaknesses in your accessory lifts. You're training your strengths and reinforcing them and getting them stronger in your main lifts. You're not wasting too much energy on any other stuff. Like, variety is good, but too much is bad. So making sure you're choosing the right ones. But then whenever you get closer to competition, some lifters actually benefit from peaking the relatively stronger muscles. So like actually doing accessory lifts that, hit their, really max out and force them to fully recruit their relatively stronger muscles are beneficial. And that's kind of like a little bit like the old school mentality. And I'm not sure if it's like they would like to choose accessory lifts because they're biased, because they were doing ones that targeted their stronger muscles, and so they enjoyed doing them. So that was kind of one thing that I've seen with kind of more old school type training mentalities. And I say like, okay, you're training your stronger muscles in your main lifts, then you're doing in your accessory lifts, and there's going to be this huge discrepancy, and your relatively weaker joint just can't even keep up, and you're just going to hit this wall. And so that is kind of one old school mentality that's shining through. And I say to a lifter, they're like, oh, I hate doing these. And I'm like, good. That means you need to be doing them. Like, oh, like, well, I could lift a lot more by going heavier. Like even lifters whose hip extensors are relatively weaker, and I tell them to do like block pulls, and they're like, oh, like, I can lift a lot. I'm like, you're doing it super upright, and you're just kind of like, you're actually using your quads to do the work for the hips in those higher positions. And I'm like, do it this way and go a lot lighter. And they're like, oh, that sucked. That was hard. I can lift a lot more than that. And they can't get kind of past that kind of like, you need to be like pain, no gain type mentality. It's like, no, you're not actually targeting the muscle. You need to be in a certain position to, feel it. It's like when you do a lunge, either you can push your knee forward, or you can be upright, or you can push your hips back. It's your execution of the lift is what matters more than anything. And that was not something that was used kind of back in the day. I like went on a total tangent in the opposite direction. But yeah, new lifters, they're just the most popular resources are the ones that kind of been around for a while. And I've seen this, and it's not that like they're not useful. It's just they're not going to be beneficial to every lifter. And that's why some lifters, they're like, oh, this program that I found really helped me. And then another lifter is like, well, this program didn't. And they'll kind of think like, okay, I did it wrong, or I sucked, or I didn't try hard enough. And it's not that. It's just the program was really playing to that person's strengths and maybe addressing their weaknesses. It's like what I was saying with like Jen Thompson, what she does in her program is not going to benefit probably a newbie lifter, because, usually the chest is what's lagging in kind of newer lifters. So understanding that it's very, individual specific. And the ideal technique is not it. And this is, I had a great chat with Alex Purcell, and we were just kind of like talking about this. And because he's like, I'm not in academia, and then he's doing his PhD. So he's like kind of like carrying the torch and like do everything that I really wanted to do, but I don't have the opportunity to do. But we're like trying to like think about what is optimal technique. It's not what something looks like. It's achieving kind of like a checklist of things.
Yeah.
And it's like, looking at, can you, maintain the same form as barbell load increases? If you can't, if it changes, either you become more upright. Some lifters become more upright. Some lifters lean forward more. Then, that's kind of like a check mark that maybe it's not optimal. Is the barbell staying over the middle of the foot, right? Optimal is making sure that your brain's like, okay, like I can just focus on producing force. If you're, focusing on weight on your heels, then like your body's like trying to prevent, falling backwards. So it's going to cause some like can create braking forces to prevent any type of backwards acceleration. So then you're wasting energy. And then it's also the, are we using excessive amounts of co-contraction? I talk about the hamstrings a lot because that's another like equipped lifting ghosts thing. In the moment in competition, it's good to use as many muscles as you can. So if you got the hips, you got the glutes, you got the hamstrings, you got the adductor magnus posterior head as a hip extensor, extensors, it makes sense to use all of them. Yeah. Right. But if it comes to the fact you're using the hamstrings a lot because the glutes are weak and you're just always, compensating and thinking weight on your heels and sitting your hamstrings and, getting a stretch of them, that's like kind of a technique you use to get like stretch in the suit to get that kind of spring out of the hole. But so there's this been like, overemphasis on the hamstrings. And one of my research projects was, modeling this out. And what does it actually do to the quads? Well, hamstrings are biarticular, they cross behind the hip and behind the knee. Yes, like theoretically, you can get like kind of energy transfer from the knee to the hip being like, it's an elastic band, right? You kind of stretch on one end, it's going to release at the other end. Or, yes, we want more muscles to help. And the hips are big, strong. There's a lot of more muscles, so we want to use them. But now that over time, and especially with the lifters that come to me with like knee issues and back issues, and, they've been kind of had this older mentality, it's because that they weren't also, addressing the glute weakness, the reason behind the hamstrings, or they were always chronically using the hamstrings and the glutes were like, remember the brain's like, why would I max this muscle out when I can use these guys? And then you use them, they get stronger. The strategy becomes reinforced. It's kind of like in your brain, you have like all these possible motor solutions and all these possible combinations of muscle contractions. And based on how the sensory feedback and like how your body feels, your brain's like, okay, this is the more appropriate one, right? It's like if you are walking and there's a tree in front of you, like either you can go right, you can go left. Well, I see that there's water on the left, so I'm going to go right. That's what the body's like constantly doing. And when it comes to like, use of the hamstrings, I see it getting reinforced a lot. And where this, it makes sense biomechanically to use them. Lifters are ending up with a lot more knee pain. And they're like, oh, it's because squatting and, it's your quads or your quad dominant. It's like, well, what if it's because you're using a lot more quads than you need to? Because if it was because of quad dominance and, pushing your knees forward and squatting deep, then why is there more knee problems in powerlifters and Olympic weightlifters?
Yeah.
So it kind of like all these kind of pieces came together, and it got to the point where we're kind of like guinea pigging and being like, what happens when I reduce tension in the hamstrings using like, self muscle release techniques? And some lifters, they'll release their hamstrings and their knee pain goes away temporarily. But as soon as they start using them again in training in the set, it comes back. So it's like, okay, so maybe it's that this overuse of the hamstrings requires the quads to work harder. right? Because the hamstrings are knee flexors, as also hip extensors, biarticular across two joints. Yes, really good for energy transfer and movements like sprinting and even the deadlift, but squatting, it's, a simultaneous movement. We want knee extension, hip extension happening and starting at the same time. Otherwise, we're going to collapse or we're going to like fall forward. We need to keep the bar over the middle of our foot, and that it needs to be a simultaneous movement like that. So the energy transfer, it's actually, probably not optimal for achieving that, what we say is that checklist of, is the bar staying over the middle of the foot? And so if the hamstrings are working harder, the quads are going to have to work harder to counteract the flexor forces going at the knee. If a lifter has a sufficient quad strength, then that's not really that big of a deal, right? Because they have enough gas in the tank to be able to, it's not like this gigantic amount of flexor forces that we found out when the modeling. But if the hamstrings are working harder, whether they're helping at the hip or whatever the technique you're choosing, you're forcing them to work harder, the quads are going to have to also probably work harder than you think. And I say that because like usually when you sit back and into your hamstrings, your shin's more vertical. And we know that the more forward the knees are, the harder the quads have to work. So it's like, okay, well, my shin's vertical. My quads aren't even really working. Well, you still have to extend the knee and they still have to fight the hamstrings to do that. Right. So the quads are probably actually working harder than you think in any of the hamstring scenarios. And so that's what I try to kind of reinforce to people. And I don't realize that I am kind of, calling out certain training mentalities because I don't keep in the loop of, who believes in this and that. And so people take kind of personal offense to stuff. And I'm just kind of like this, I'm actually pretty unbiased because I just don't have the time to keep up with the popular powerlifting culture. And I'm like, oops, sorry.
I think from what
objective opinion.
Yeah, it's a little bit, a lot of times you said there, not necessarily what you think, and then sometimes what you think it is. Sometimes going a little bit deeper, it's a little bit like, well, what about this? What about if we tried that? And then, when you were what you mentioned sort of earlier on, what was kind of resonating with me is that, if it's a case of, oh, well, I can lift heavier, I can do this. And you've probably seen it in the gym. I know I've seen people lift, and technique wise, you just think, wow, how have you managed to lift that? Whereas actually addressing certain areas, addressing technique, one of the key words that you mentioned there is efficient. And I think to get stronger in anything, you need to improve your efficiency. You can increase the amount of ceiling that you've got to get stronger, because I think that's where, dialing it back in terms of strength training, it's a skill. There is going to be things that we need to work on. And one thing that you mentioned earlier, the squat, in terms of a human movement, how many times do we get up and out of a chair? How many times, do we do that movement during a day? But yet, as soon as we, put a barbell on our back or do anything like that, all of a sudden it's like, oh, right, I know I'm
boring.
Yeah, this is what's going to happen. And kind of the next thing, just building off from what you've mentioned there. Obviously, we've spoken about, maybe opposite ends of the spectrum, in terms of, for some of the elite lifters who are lifting, crazy amounts of weight, and that technique that works for them, compared to some people, because there are some people who, physically they can just do a textbook squat because all the proportions can just fit with that. From somebody who potentially is in the middle a little bit, what is kind of acceptable, either way? Is it a case of, are some things, as long as it doesn't, because again, you touched on it before about, injury and just sort of like still going down this rabbit hole, overuse, and then it becomes an issue with an injury. How much do you sort of is acceptable before you kind of say, yeah, potentially we need to try and address this a little bit more? Or is that not highlighted until, like what we spoke about a little bit earlier, once we hit a certain weight and more things are identified? If that all kind of makes sense.
Like in terms of like switching their technique or switching.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I say, like, to the lifters that I work with, like, very rarely do I ask the lifter to switch their technique, because one, like, what you practice is what you're going to be good at. And when and like some lifters, they're like, okay, well, I tried heels this week, or I tried water this week, or I tried doing this week. If you're constantly changing it, it's like almost like relearning a new motor task, and you're going to see a temporary decline in performance, and just kind of like running in quicksand, or, like trying to get ahead, but you're just like, your body's like, okay, I gotta get better at this kind of, movement and this kind of strategy, and making sure my muscles are, efficient at contracting or recruiting in them. um, so I like to first kind of just give them the freedom, that they know their body better than they realize. So if there looks to be this big discrepancy, and like I say, like cues can only go so far, right? Cues don't work on a max attempt unless like the lifter is, focusing so much of being upright and they're collapsing forward. So what they're doing, they're like arching their back and flaring, and arching your back is probably just as bad as rounding your back when it comes to a bar. It's like either you're like this, with the bar coming down if your back's rounded, or you're like the complete opposite. And it's just like that kind of wishbone effect. And it's just, what stress are you putting on the posterior ligaments of the spine or the anterior ligaments of the spine? So yeah, like there is that acceptable, like we want to get a reasonable amount of, neutral hip hinge, and to prevent injury and everything like that. But um, if they're thinking about, okay, I need to stay upright, then that cue is working against them. So I'll kind of shift their focus to be like, focus on how you're exerting force on the ground, and be like, think about leg drive. Because if you're not producing leg drive, chest up doesn't matter, right? The squat is a leg movement, it's a lower body movement, not like a back extension movement, right? So it's sometimes, yes, kind of just getting them to focus on the right things in terms of cueing, but that doesn't necessarily mean changing their technique, right? Um, and I say, like, we see this weakness. If changing your focus of, what your leg drive versus arching, if that's like the lifter's problem, if that doesn't kind of immediately change it, and I'll say, like, try it for like a week first, or let's try this technique if it doesn't, or this kind of strategy if it doesn't work for like a week, then it's going to really require bringing up the strength of the relatively weaker. And I say, let your squat technique naturally evolve. So if we're slowly bringing up the strength of the relatively weaker muscle group, with like accessory lifts, like I say, like it takes like at least 4 weeks to really start seeing it manifest in the competition lifts. So as it gets stronger, it's going to be a heavier barbell load before the compensation has to happen. Right. So think of it as like a bottleneck and like chain reaction. It's, one muscle group can't do its job, transfer loading. That can't do its job, transfer loading. But there's only so many places you can, compensate and transfer loading to, or get other muscles to help out at the joint. So it's going to get to the point where there's just pure like energetic failure of the system. So it'll be a heavier load before that compensation happens. And so we're talking about like, instead of your form breaking down to like 80% of your 1RM, it's going to break down at like 90%. And that's like a huge sign of progress. And it's going to be a heavier load before the chain reaction happens. So it'll be a heavier load that you can ultimately lift.
Yeah.
Right. And then the closer and closer those relative strengths get, there's going to be less of a degree of compensation total. And so that is just like knowing that their body's going to do what it has to do. Otherwise, like, and I love chatting and assessing physios, because they are so like cognizant of their body and how they're moving and their positioning, that sometimes their level of expertise actually works against them, and that they can sense so well if something happens. And so they like subconsciously don't go past it. And so it's like, well, if you did allow this kind of little bit of a form breakdown to happen, you would lift heavier. So, if that's your goal in powerlifting, then it's okay. And then just use that information to, address it and why it's happening. And, instead of kind of limiting yourself. But again, tangent. Uh, but it will naturally change their technique. And I've actually had some lifters that, like, say they were so quad dominant, and I like use that term loosely. It's just their quads were relatively stronger and they had a super very upright technique, but they're like that all or none lifter and they just failed in the higher positions, and people never understood it because they're like, what? Like you're like, that looks so easy, but it's just their hips couldn't take over as that make it or break it muscle group and maintain that like the energy in the top half of the lift. So, you work on hip extensor strength and bring up the strength. And then they've actually gone to the complete opposite spectrum where now they're actually, hip extensors are relatively stronger. And like that takes time, if there was a big discrepancy in the beginning, but it does happen. So it's about monitoring and just being like, okay, like your technique is evolving because of this. And so we have to scale that back and go back. Or some lifters, they're actually fairly balanced. And so you have to kind of constantly monitor what they're doing, being okay, you've gone too far. Let's bring it back to the center. That's usually more kind of advanced lifters are like that. But yeah, it's the squat, like I say, like it's your technique is gonna, on a max attempt, it's either going to be limited because you're trying to achieve a certain ideal, or it's going to be dependent on just letting your body figure out how it can more evenly distribute how hard the muscles are by transferring loading. So stop stressing about what you think it should look like and let it naturally evolve over time. Again, the cues are basically like making sure they're using their muscles optimally, not like making them look a certain way. It's like a lifter with knee valgus. They're using their adductor magnus more than they need to be, because something that the glutes aren't doing their job well. And so it's like, okay, let's, figure out why. There's a couple of different reasons why. It's not that big of a deal, just your muscles trying to do what they need to do. And as we address that and we get on the right track and figure out the why, then, it's going to evolve. And then like the knee valgus gets less and less and less, rather than thinking about knees out, like, or yeah, there's so many different cues, like hips through, when the lifters, like their hips are behind them and they're leaned forward. It's like, hey, the reason why I'm at the sticking point is because my hips can't handle the position I'm in. Like they can't produce enough force. They're, otherwise I'd be popping through it. So you're telling me to push my hips through and use my muscles that are maxed out even more. Okay, let's use like a different like tip, like knees forward, like rebend the knees, get the quads back into the game, or like something like that. So yeah, the cues, they are what we do to get proficient at the movement. But when it comes to, taking strength performance as a powerlifter to the next level, it's, let the relative strengths guide you, I guess, and let it naturally evolve.
Yeah. I think especially from what we first started talking about, a little bit similar to what you mentioned about your assessment when you're saying there about, I know for me as a lifter, my technique has changed, one, as I've gone up weight classes, but also in terms of, changing technique. When I first started, I was doing high bar, transitioned to low bar, and now my technique has changed. And as well, when you mentioned in there about technique might break down at 80%, it might break down at 90%. Progress in powerlifting and strength training isn't necessarily more weight on the bar. Sometimes it's a case of, right, we need to get more proficient and efficient at these exercises, and build up that threshold of when technique is breaking down, which is kind of one of those things that we've spoken about. What people think about might be holding them back in terms of technique, or the need to lift a certain amount of weight. Whereas sort of like a couple of times you've touched on it is understand the lifter understanding what their body's doing, what muscles are actually working, and having a little bit more understanding of it, because then that way, from the assessments and working together with a coach, you can pick up on these things a little bit more, rather than feeling as though this needs to be the technique that I need to do and kind of flogging a dead horse sometimes of, no, this is what's
No.
getting me stronger.
Don't lean forward. It's like,
Yeah,
don't tell your lifter to stop falling forward, because they're falling forward for a reason. So if you keep just say don't do this, it's going to be, really deterring to them, and they're going to have this being like, "Ugh, I I did it wrong again" type mentality, and it's it's not encouraging to lifters, and it's not going to add to their success and kind of like the programming. So yeah.
yeah, definitely. Quite a lot of topics covered there. A few
Mhm.
tangents thrown in. But the last question that I like to ask, from everything that we've chatted about there, from understanding how your body's going to work, what muscles are working, looking at technique. What would be your take-home points or words of wisdom for everyone listening?
Your competition technique should play to your strengths. Your accessory lifts should address your weaknesses. That's number one. Number two is, when it comes to accessory lifts, it's not about like the load you're lifting. It's your body positioning, or how hard you think you're moving. So don't program accessory lifts by percents, or like how strong your main lift is, or anything like that. Program them based on, can you achieve a certain position to provide a mechanical disadvantage for that weaker link, and actually train it, type thing. If you're otherwise, it's about efficiency in terms of executing the lift, but also efficiency in energy being used in terms of getting the training adaptations and stronger muscles.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to round it off. And one thing that you mentioned there, which as you've been talking, been thinking about it in terms of that unbiased view of, oh well, I'm going to follow this program, I'm going to follow this program. Whereas actually, if you just look at it as in terms of, right, how can I get this person stronger? That's what we need. That's what we need to focus on. There needs to be whatever method or whatever you're using, it's got to be specific to that person, but then also allowing them to, yeah, we've mentioned it a couple of times throughout this chat, being efficient in terms of getting stronger, and understanding the why, in terms of, right, okay, have we had a look at this? What can we work on? Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on, Megan. Really, really enjoyed, picking your brains and hearing you speak about a couple of these topics. For everyone listening who might want to see the content you put out there, have any questions about what we've spoken about today, or even have get in touch for an assessment or consultation with yourself, where can people find you, or reach out to you?
Yeah, my website is kineticadvantage.ca. I stress the CA because a lot of people put .com, and they go the wrong direction. And for my Instagram, where I put a lot of content out and helping people kind of fine tune their technique, their coaching eye, or their technique eye, it is megan.kineticadvantage.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. Like I say, really, really enjoyed chatting with you. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.